This is a teaser, a 20-minute taste of what you get as a subscriber of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. Dead Sleep is listener-supported and ad-free. So if you like what you hear and you want to hear the whole thing, subscribe now via Patreon, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Links are in the show notes. Good evening, and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and this is the November bonus episode. Thank you so much for being a paid subscriber. I am devoting this episode, and probably a couple of more episodes, to the life and career of Ann Rule. If you love true crime, you likely know the work of Ann Rule. Ann Rule was, and remains, one of the most famous and prolific true crime writers of all time. Her career spanned decades. She crossed paths with not one but two serial killers and lived to tell the tale, along with scores of other dangerous murderers. What many people don't know about Ann Rule was that in 2015, she was herself the apparent target of a secret and sinister plot to frighten and harass her. Someone from her life, from her past, who authorities believed wanted to do her harm. There appeared to be someone intimidating Ann Rule, stealthily and ruthlessly stealing from Ann, draining her bank accounts of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars, chipping away, little by little, at her sizable fortune. What appeared to be happening? It wasn't cold-blooded murder, but draining someone's finances and wearing them down emotionally, physically, mentally, was death by 1,000 cuts. Who had it out for Ann Rule? The answer to that question would prove as twisty and turny as one of Ann's best-selling books. And you'll hear all about it in this November bonus episode I'm calling The Strangers Beside Her. And I'm dedicating this episode to my friend, the filmmaker and author Eric Cushing, who introduced me to Ann Rule's work. And is there a true crime saga you'd like to hear as a Dead Sleep story? Let us know at deadsleeppodcast@gmail.com. And if we use that story suggestion, you'll enjoy a special dedication in that future episode. And as always, there is no graphic violence in this podcast, but there are plenty of dead sleep detours to fatigue your mind and help you drift off and fall asleep. Our story begins in the spring of 2015 in a small, cozy town called Normandy Park, located roughly 30 minutes south of Seattle, Washington. Now, when you think the Pacific Northwest, we often think rain. Sheets of it. Drop after drop after drop. Gray skies. Lots of gloom. But in the spring, in that area, there's another phenomenon. The blooming of the cherry blossom trees. Cherry blossoms only bloom for a short period of time. And that's what makes them so special. For a few brief, glorious weeks. Those gray streets and skies of the Pacific Northwest are abloom with beautiful pink, gentle petals, gracing the world with their glory. Suddenly gone too soon. In Japan, cherry blossoms are a symbol of the ephemera of life. No one knew the fleeting nature of precious lives more than crime writer Anne Rule, who'd lived in Normandy Park and the Seattle area for years. Anne had made a career out of telling the tragic stories of young, beautiful lives, mostly women, that were taken far too soon. Their futures faded, fallen away, just like the blooms on those cherry blossoms. And now, tragically, it seemed Anne's own life was falling away, little by little. Once Anne was a mighty force, a tenacious member of the Seattle police force and an intrepid reporter who covered the grisliest of murder cases in exacting detail. By 2015, Anne was physically and mentally vulnerable. Anne was in her early 80s, and she'd fallen and broken her hip in 2013 at a book signing. And she'd been confined to a wheelchair ever since. Her once fiery red hair was now a faded yellow, like tarnished gold. Her mind was tarnished too. Once a steel trap, it'd grown rusty over time. She couldn't remember things like she used to. She found it hard to stay focused, sometimes felt confused, and more recently, afraid. And she wasn't the only one. Certain members of Anne's family and her close friends were also worried about Anne. One of Anne's 4 children, Leslie, who was also a crime writer, had written to authorities, along with her husband, expressing their concern about something that was going on. Could the Seattle police look into it? Was there anything that could be done? They believed someone was hurting their mother, and they weren't sure what to do. The question for authorities was, who would have it out for an 84-year-old woman in a wheelchair? But this was Anne Rule. And Anne Rule had millions of fans. And more than a few enemies. She'd exposed so many bad men. The kind of men who had nothing but time and nothing but rage against the woman they believed had destroyed their lives. Murderers. Some of the worst killers you can imagine had plotted revenge against Anne Rule over her 30-year career. Men who would hold grudges and be more than happy to manipulate, to steal, and to intimidate anyone they had to get to Anne Rule. It wasn't easy. Anne was tough, always had been. She grew up close to crime. In the 1930s and 40s as a child in Michigan, she had family members who were sheriffs, a medical examiner. She was no stranger to the brutality of human nature and the need for justice. By the time Anne went to college, her interest led her to the University of Washington in Seattle, where she studied psychology, criminology, and creative writing. 3 skills and a location that would serve her well over the coming decades as a best-selling crime writer, as did her brief stint working in law enforcement with the Seattle Police Department, a job that would bring Anne close to violent crime scenes and forge many connections with detectives and cops that would come in handy. But it wasn't until the early 1970s when Anne would get up close and very personal with a real killer. And what a killer he was. In 1971, while serving as a volunteer at a suicide crisis hotline, Anne struck up a friendship with a fellow suicide hotline volunteer, a handsome, funny, affable college student named Ted Bundy. Ted was in his 20s, and Anne was nearly 40. Their relationship was like big sister, little brother. He would often talk to Anne about his future prospects and his relationship troubles with women. They didn't, on the face of things, have a lot in common. Anne was a single mom with 4 kids. Ted was just making his way in the world. But they did share something at their core, a raw ambition. Anne was working to make a name for herself as a crime writer, a struggling writer who turned out articles in True Detective magazine under a male pseudonym named Andy Stackhouse. She was looking for that big break. Meanwhile, her buddy, Ted Bundy, was building a career of his own as one of the most, if not the most, disturbed, psychopathic serial predators the world had ever known, with a grotesque and complicated criminal saga that spanned several years and several states before he was caught and convicted and sentenced to death back in the 1980s. Ultimately, he confessed to an estimated 30 killings, though Anne would later wonder if there were many, many more women who were victims of Ted Bundy. Now, Anne basically fell into this story. She had no idea Ted Bundy was the very killer that everyone was looking for. And in fact, she defended him for a long time, maybe too long. And the complicated relationship led to some ethical questions about Anne Rule's behavior on this particular book. But the most important thing for Anne Rule and for this episode is the title of that book. It was called The Stranger Beside Me. And that title really captured Anne's unnerving realization that even when you think you know someone, you really don't. And sometimes it's the people closest to you who are capable of doing the most harm. The Stranger Beside Me remains a true crime classic. It's one of the essentials in the true crime canon. And it would be the template for just about every book she wrote afterwards. Disturbing stories about people who seemed totally ordinary, even exceptional. People you think you could trust with your own children could turn out to be a serial killer. Ted Bundy had a type. brunettes with hair parted in the middle, college girls in the bloom of their youth. And thanks to Ted Bundy, Ann Rule also had a type. The type of killer she liked to write about. She described them as the handsome, charismatic anti-hero, the kind of man women saw as Prince Charming, who would turn out to be their worst nightmare. Now, years later, in 2015, when all of this stuff was happening to Ann Rule, Ted Bundy was in no way a plausible suspect. He was dead. Ted Bundy was executed at the age of 42, way back in 1989. But that case would be very important to Ann. One, because it gave her the blueprint of the type of killer she liked to write about. And two, it led to another huge serial killer case. His name was Gary Ridgway, dubbed the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway's hunting ground was in King County, Washington, which includes Seattle and the surrounding area. Gary Ridgway wasn't the handsome, charming type like Ted Bundy. What they had in common was that Gary, like Ted, blended in. A husband, a father, a part of the community. He defied a lot of these stereotypes about the antisocial serial killer. The case of the Green River Killer spanned even longer than Ted Bundy's, with Gary Ridgway claiming the lives of close to 50 young women and girls, likely more, until he was caught in 2001. Ann's book about the Green River Killer took years, and it's considered by most to be her masterpiece. It's called Green River Running Red. And for me, it's a little too violent, with too many graphic details. It's something that you definitely can't listen to before bed. And it's one that I would caution listening to in the daytime. And we're not going to go into all of the terrible things that the Green River Killer did to his victims. But what's important here, because it was part of what Ann Rule's appeal was and why she was so groundbreaking. She often took the perspective and was a champion for victims and their families. This led to her many critics saying that Ann Rule wasn't a real journalist. She was biased. But in the cases that she was writing about, especially with Green River Running Red, there was no one else speaking out for these women. Even back in the 1980s and 90s, when Gary Ridgway was most active, these cases struggled to capture public sympathy. Attention, yes, but sympathy for the victims, no. And that's the way Gary Ridgway liked it. He strategically targeted women who were cast-offs, sex workers, and runaways, the kinds of girls and young women that people weren't actively looking for, whose family members had kicked them out or given up on them long ago. What I really like about Green River Running Red is that in this opus, it's over 600 pages, Ann Rule spends a lot of time talking about the backstories of the victims of Gary Ridgway, so you understand the circumstances that led many of these unfortunate women to end up where they did in the first place. What made them such vulnerable targets to someone like Gary Ridgway, and why their murder cases were harder to solve, and how their deaths weren't their fault. That sounds obvious to you and me, but at that time, those women were thought to have been asking for it. And through her dogged research, Anne wrote a powerful counter-narrative to that assumption. Gary Ridgway was still alive in 2015. He was in prison for the rest of his life. But it turned out, despite everything she'd written about him in Green River Running Red, it didn't appear Gary Ridgway had any grudge against Anne Rule. He was proud of what he did. If anything, he'd only harass her to write her a thank you note for making him famous. Now, Anne had written a lot of books, and there were a lot of killers who despised her. But there was one who was still alive in 2015. This one man appeared to despise Anne Rule more than any other.